They just want to rearrange the space. I was like, it's 3 of us sharing an office, all glass. It's not that big of a deal.
Class is good though. I can take one over the top. Gonna make a little bit of a haul, but some of our classmates gave me an insight on the AI class.
Yeah. He's a good dude.
Hey, really good dude.
He's also going to Germany too.
He is. I know this.
Bavaria.
And he's also married the same year I was, and his kids are the same age as
Get
mine.
out of here.
So yeah, we are.
Is he taking command?
He's doing Garrison Command.
Oh, good.
Yep.
And Bavaria's like, my humble opinion, it's probably the better one to garrison in Europe. Because he gets Amish.
Yeah. And you're further away from the flagpole. So everybody's further to the west.
Yeah.
Bavaria, you're kind of off by yourself, especially as garrison commander. It's kind of.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. His wife was over at our house, Carolina.
Yeah.
She was over last week, and her and Molly seemed to kind of hit it off pretty well. So, yeah, it's like our lives are almost exactly the same right now. We're getting crushed with diapers and needy 3-year-olds.
Short-lived, dude. It'll be short-lived.
Oh, no. Different problems, you're right, yeah. I think, more severe consequential problems.
The SATs.
I thought I heard that's not a requirement anymore.
I don't think it was SATs and ACTs aren't.
Yeah.
They still push it and have at least one or the other. That's it. So the SATs is important to prep for it. That's where I'm at with the sophomore. Is prep for next year when everything starts to become more serious.
What's your approach? Are you looking at like study programs?
It's really the biggest thing I'm trying to do is to broaden vocabulary. Because I feel like they don't read as much and they don't have as they're used to sending short texts and they learn.
Good point.
English is hard.
They were seriously. I've been asking like, "What you writing?" I laugh because the military was doing it all like cursive in the 1800s, which is all
Okay, everybody, we got a couple announcements to make before we start, all right? First announcement, movie night tonight, 7 days in May. Kirk Douglas Saves the Constitution from Burt Lancaster. Pizza will be served, all right? Second thing, the military fellows are putting on a spectacular 2-part field trip. As you know, military fellows do a field trip in the fall and they help us organize the big overseas field trip in the spring. Now, we're all used to remote, we pick and choose stuff on remote, what we sign in for. This is not the way SSP field trips go. You do both or you do neither, all right? So, make sure all the graduate students, you're a leader here, make sure all the graduate students know that and make sure they sign up so Laura can get the logistics ready for the fall field trip, all right? Any other questions before we start the program? Raymond, you too. You guys are old guys. All right. I don't have, who else are old graduates? All right.
Try to minimize.
I appreciate it.
said it's the first time. Yeah. At one point, I was like, I know what I'm talking about. It's good. Because I think that's but when we're picture words on picture word picture.
I was going to picture on there. It's just
Oh no. Oh, that's it's kind of like the materials you're reading for a different purpose and values too. So I'm having a little. It's not better word. And it was an interesting conversation.
To be fair, we were
There's always grumble. You got to worry when there's no grumble. That's when there's
Be like someone dropped.
No, I appreciate that you're not the answer to all the problems, but it's a start. How much? And it's really because we do relative comment kind of calculations. Yeah, kind of the same thing. Yeah.
Going on. All right, everybody, welcome to the second in the MIT Security Studies Program Wednesday seminars. I'm Roger Peterson. I'm acting director filling in for Taylor Fravel, who's on a well-deserved sabbatical leave. And today we are lucky enough to have Erica Lonergan talking on cultural change in military organizations, hackers, and warriors in the U.S. Army. And there's a nicely written bio, so I'm just going to read it. Dr. Erica Lonergan is an assistant professor in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Previously, Erica held several positions at the United States Military Academy at West Point. These include serving as assistant professor in the departments of social science and electrical engineering and computer science, a fellow at the Army Cyber Institute, the executive director of the Rupert H. Johnson Grant Strategy Program. She has also held positions as a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Atlantic Council. Beyond her academic and research appointments, Erica has an extensive background in strategy and policy. Erica currently serves as a member of the Board of Visitors of the U.S. Army War College. Previously, she was a lead writer of the 2023 U.S. Department of Defense Cyber Strategy, as well as the congressionally mandated Department of Defense Cyber Posture Review. Prior to that, Erica served as a senior director on the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, a bipartisan congressional commission established to develop a new strategy and policies to defend the United States in cyberspace. Erica continues to serve as a senior advisor to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission 2.0. She also held an appointment as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow, with placement at J.P. Morgan Chase and the U.S. Cyber Command at the Cyber National Mission Force. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to stand at the podium. And given the state of women's attire, I have to sort of hold this microphone. So if you all have trouble hearing me, let me know. But I'm really excited to be here talking about this research project on cultural change in military organizations. I've thought a lot about military culture and military organizations and a lot about cyber issues, and this project kind of brings those two together. This is actually part of a broader research agenda that I'm working on with a colleague of mine at Columbia, Jack Snyder. He sort of, where's my water? Hold on. He sort of brings the culture, strategic culture perspective, and I bring the cyber perspective, and we decided that it would be good to explore these issues together. So I'll talk about the project and then really look forward to discussion and Q&A with everyone. Okay, So why study cyberspace through a cultural lens? I would posit that cyber is ripe for cultural-based approaches. There's a long and vast and deep literature on how strategic culture and military culture shape how professional military organizations organize themselves, prepare for war, how they develop doctrine and strategy, how they conceive of their role and identity as professional military organizations. And so there's this rich literature to draw on. At the same time, in the past decade plus, you've had the emergence of cyberspace as a warfighting domain. And it's posed these real questions, and I would argue challenges to military organizations about how, both from a constitutive sense of like what does it mean to fight war in and through cyberspace, and also how military should organize around cyber warfare. And I think that, you know, the fact that there are these endless debates about what cyber is good for, whether it's cyber is really an intelligence contest, whether it's this revolutionary new form of warfare, whether it's an environment that requires initiative persistence at the tactical and operational level, I think all of these things suggest that there are these unresolved cultural debates about the cyber domain, and hopefully this research project aims to weigh in on those questions. I also think that the sort of persistent uncertainties and ambiguity about cyberspace make it more likely that elites will sort of turn to cultural lenses and existing cultural repertoires to help understand and make sense of an ambiguous, esoteric, uncertain environment. And so I would argue, we would argue that cyberspace is particularly ripe for cultural-based studies. And so what we're aiming to do in this research project, and this is sort of the start of a broader research agenda, so I'm really looking forward to your feedback and thoughts on this particular issue, but also the interaction of culture and emerging tech in general, is explore how cyber technologies, which are embedded in cyber cultures, may be shaping and changing military culture. So we're really interested in cultural change, what are its causes, what are its processes, and what are its implications. Okay. So very briefly, just some brush clearing in terms of definitions. On the one hand, we have strategic culture and military culture. These are related but distinct concepts. Strategic culture focuses on political culture as it pertains to national security, especially as it pertains to the use of force. It comprises the beliefs, attitudes, and habits pertaining to the use of force that are distinctive, enduring, and shared within a group. Each of those attributes has been contested and unpacked by researchers of strategic culture, how distinctive cultures truly are, how enduring they are. And so this issue of cultural change is something that we really jump in on in this project, as well as where culture lives, like what level of analysis, what is the unit in which the group of, what is the group in which culture lives. And then you have military culture, which tends to be more focused on constitutive questions, like what is the nature of the profession of arms, who are we, and how does our identity shape what we do? And so this draws a lot on Beth Keir's work on military culture. And so what's interesting is across both of these bodies of literature, one of the things that cultural explanations tend to struggle with or fall short on is accounting for cultural change. So in this project, we try to explore from sort of an endogenous perspective how change might be possible. Okay, so just to briefly review the literature on culture and on cultural change in particular, there's sort of two schools of thought. One generally sees culture as being fixed. This is a predominant view, especially in strategic culture literature. If change happens, it's likely to be incremental and slow. It's evolutionary rather than revolutionary. And when it is revolutionary, it's likely to occur as a result of exogenous shock, right? The paradigmatic examples are the significant cultural shifts that happened in German and Japanese strategic culture after defeat in World War II, specifically shift to pacifism, right? But more recently, there's been work that explores cultural change. And a lot of this focuses on sort of endogenous or within organizational sources of change. And it relates to an emergence of studies of subcultures. So breaking down culture as a monolith and exploring competing and potentially internally intentioned subcultures. It builds on older work, though. It builds on Swidler's work on culture as a toolkit, right, that elites can kind of strategically draw on in different contexts to advance their goals. More recently, there's been a lot of really interesting work on how subcultures interact in contexts where the dominant culture can't address a particular challenge. Not when you have an exogenous shock like defeat in war, but there's just some sort of strategic challenge that the dominant culture can't completely account for or grapple with. And here, and in this context, you may have subcultures emerge, that were waiting in the wings, emerge, offer alternative viewpoints, contest through different narratives and framings and discourse, and try to affect cultural change. So what we're trying to do in this project is extend these arguments to the cyber domain. As I mentioned earlier, we think that elites are highly likely to reach for cultural repertoires in this sort of ambiguous and uncertain cyberspace environment, and also that cyber cultures are likely to pose unique challenges to dominant military cultures, and I'll talk about why that is in a few minutes. There's been a lot of really interesting work recently that's explored strategic culture as an independent variable in terms of how it explains various outcomes that we care about in international security, whether it's innovation in doctrine, whether it's preferences for offensive versus defensive strategies, or variation in strategic behavior. So this takes strategic culture and explores outcomes as it pertains to strategic behavior in cyberspace. What we're doing is sort of rewinding a bit and looking at culture itself as the dependent variable, and specifically focusing on cultural change or the lack of cultural change. And this is because there hasn't been an exogenous shock in cyberspace that's comparable to exogenous shocks that precipitated major cultural change in the past, right? Despite warnings of policymakers for many, many years now, there has not been a major cyber Pearl Harbor, a cybergeddon. I could keep going with all the analogies, right? A cyber 9/11. There hasn't been sort of a major defeat in cyber war that would prompt military organizations to kind of reassess and reevaluate whether cultures are appropriately suited to this domain. And yet we see militaries kind of struggling to figure out, how do we organize ourselves for cyber war? What does it mean to fight cyber war? And so we kind of think that this is an area where change from within might be more apt to explore change in culture from an internal perspective rather than an exogenous one. And so that's what we do. So we take this sort of abductive approach. We exist sort of in the intermediate realm between deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, where we think there's some really interesting and important insights from the strategic culture literature, specifically the literature on cultural change, that can illuminate dynamics of change in a cyber context, while generating insights inductively from an in-depth case study of the US Army in particular. And so this is really a theory building exercise that we're hoping to extend and apply insights to other cases, both within the United States and cross-nationally. So this is sort of the first attempt at that. And so what we do is we conducted extensive interviews with what we call culture entrepreneurs within the Army. These were people at various levels of seniority, mostly in the officer corps, who were kind of thinking about and writing about what it meant to have a cyber culture in the Army, even before the Army established formal organizations for cyberspace. And we also couple that with analysis of the writings that they did. So they wrote and published articles in various journals, and Army-specific outlets and so on, kind of articulating this vision of cultural change. And so what we do is we look at, in particular, the decision by the Army to create a cyber branch. And we focus on the branch because it is the unique entity within the US Army in particular that socializes entrance into branch culture, right? You have these educational and training institutions that are established around your branch. I pulled some of these quotes from some of the interviews that we did that really illustrate the relationship between the branch as an institution and its role in cultivating culture and socializing entrance into a particular branch culture, which exists as a subculture within the broader Army culture. My favorite quote is the idea that the culture of your branch is so strong that switching branches is painful, right? But of course, with the creation of cyber organizations, people who had pre-existing identities had and steeped in branch cultures had to make decisions about doing that. And what we do is we sort of trace what we see as the interaction of a cyber hacker culture that was external to the Army, external to military organizations, with the Army's dominant warfighting culture, to look at how these culture entrepreneurs try to leverage narrative and frames and symbols and so on, and I'll go through all of that in a minute, to promote a new cyber culture that could exist within the Army. What we find is that, first of all, that culture matters. In almost all of the interviews, not almost, all of the interviews we did, without even talking about culture, culture was just part of the discussion. That's true for the writings also that were published, 10, 15 years ago, about how the Army should organize itself for cyber. And that change took place largely endogenously, right? The change was prompted from within. It was this grassroots movement by self-styled mavericks who existed in different places in the Army, who felt that they didn't fit in for various reasons, who were trying to promote a new culture and a new identity for the Army in cyberspace, coupled with the opportunity created also from within the Army, but by a group of senior leaders, particularly Chief of Staff of the Army and the first commander of Army Cyber Command, which created an opportunity for these culture entrepreneurs to kind of promote their vision and try to advance cultural change. Ultimately, that change was incomplete. And I'll talk about what I think some of the implications of that incomplete change are for strategy and policy. Okay, so as I mentioned, there was no real exogenous shock here. Instead, it was the creation of new organizations for cyberspace that created this dilemma for the Army, which was how to organize its personnel in particular for cyberspace. And the Army, as in all military organizations, personnel is policy, right? So in 2010, Cyber Command was created, a joint combatant command that at the time was subordinate to Strategic Command. And each of the services also created component commands. So you had the creation of Army Cyber Command. You had 10th Fleet. You had the Air Force do a number of different permutations and arrive finally at its Service Component Command, and so on. And so this created this dilemma about what it meant to have cyber forces in the Army. And so one of the people I interviewed who was involved in this process, working on the Army staff doing economic and manpower analysis at the time around this issue, he described this dilemma in terms of the fact that his office received a request for something that didn't exist, right? And this posed this challenge because how do you fulfill a request for something that doesn't exist? So as he says, we didn't have a cyber force. We didn't know what General Keith Alexander at the time, the first commander of Cyber Command, meant when he asked us to send him cyber forces. So this kicked off this process sort of from the top down about figuring out what does it mean for the Army to have cyber forces? Where should these forces live? And who are they and what do they do? This also created an opportunity from the bottom up for all of those self-styled mavericks who had been writing and thinking and talking about what it meant to have a cyber entity in the Army to push their vision of cultural change. And I think that this dilemma really manifests itself in two ways, according to two questions, right? One is, what is the role of cyberspace in warfighting, specifically from the Army's perspective in modern land warfare? And what makes for a cyber warrior? That's the personnel issue. How do we identify who are the people that should populate these forces? And what are their attributes? And so what you end up having, as I alluded to earlier, is this effort by these culture entrepreneurs to draw from and attempt to combine ideas and frames and concepts from an external cyber culture with sort of traditional Army warfighting culture, and to try to, from this combination, produce this new cyber culture that could coexist peacefully and in an integrated way with the Army's dominant warfighting culture. This is just a heuristic. It simplifies a lot of things because cultures are not monolithic. Within a particular service, we have subcultures, right, that are sometimes in tension with one another. Cyber hacker culture is even more fluid than military organizational culture because it doesn't live in one place, right? You have these techno-utopians in Silicon Valley, you have big tech, you have all of these different actors who together comprise this amorphous blob that we're calling cyber hacker culture. But what I think is really interesting is that there are these core tenets that are generally common sort of within Army warfighting culture and within cyber hacker culture that really are meeting with a lot of friction. At the same time, though, there are some areas of congruence, and that's where these grassroots actors are able to leverage some of those overlaps to try to present new framings. So if you look on the left, we have some of the traditional attributes of Army warfighting culture, right? The idea that warfare is this eternal, fundamental, unchanging thing. You know, specific aspects may change over time, but it's this inherently human endeavor. Whereas in cyber culture, it's nearly the opposite, right? The technological environment is dynamic and changing. There are no constants, right? Everything is changing all the time. At the apex of the cultural hierarchy in the Army is the combat arms branches. You have, infantry is the queen, and artillery is the king of battle. The relative balance between the queen and king vary depending on concepts of warfare. The king fires may be a bit more ascendant now, but regardless, it's this, from both a cultural and an institutional perspective, combat arms are the apex of the hierarchy. Physical prowess distinguishes the most competent. Warfare is decisive at the tactical level. Hierarchy is important. Of course, the credibility of the chain of command is paramount, which there is some tension there because modern professional militaries also value the initiative and delegation of authority to lower echelons, but that's all within the confines of integrity of the chain of command, right, which is very different from hacker culture. The small unit is the level of analysis. There's a focus on operational command more so than on technical expertise, even though we could get into a discussion about the Army's relationship with technology. And then really importantly, a generalist approach to leadership, right? That's literally the term at the highest level of command is a general officer, right? At some point you become a generalist, and that has implications for how we think about highly technical work roles. And on the right, we have cyber culture, where technical expertise is the coin of the realm rather than physical prowess. You've demonstrated not by, doing, ruck marches or engaging in other types of physical feats and contests, but rather your demonstrated ability in technical things, not even through certifications or honors or degrees or certificates or, the equivalent of tabs and so on, but through your demonstrated ability. It's anti-hierarchical. It's your proven skills and ability rather than your rank that conveys, or your position in a hierarchy that conveys credibility. And it's very much individually oriented, right? So it's about individual experimentation, taking the initiative, moving fast and breaking things, which is opposed to a culture where moving fast and breaking things can in some circumstances lead to the literal breaking of things and people, right, if mistakes are made. So anyway, this is, again, it's a heuristic. It's not meant to perfectly capture all the dimensions of these cultural differences, but it sort of shows how a cyber culture and the technologies in which those cultures are embedded, which grew up outside of military organizations, may be posing challenges to militaries who are trying to figure out how to organize themselves to wage warfare in this domain. Okay. So what we do is we sort of explore how and the extent of cultural change prompted by, the challenges posed by the emergence of cyberspace as a domain of warfare. And what I found really fascinating as part of this research, especially in the interviews, was that really put simply, culture matters, right? There was a deliberate effort, and people talked about a deliberate effort to inculcate and create a new culture within the Army to sort of promote cultural change. And that was sort of the language across these interviews. I just have a few examples up here at various levels of seniority, right? But some of the early leaders and thinkers, whether it's early accessions into the cyber branch, or the first commandant of the Army Cyber Schoolhouse, in some of the early thinkers within West Point and Army Network Warfare Battalion, early Army organizations for cyberspace, who all kind of come back to this idea of culture. On the one hand, there's this vision of changing a culture and incorporating elements from a hacker mindset into the Army, but also balanced against the realization that this new cyber culture can't be so distant from the kinetic warfighter that we risk irrelevance, right? So it's like, how do you create this new cyber culture that can coexist within Army culture? And this is especially important. There was this perception that a new cyber culture could not, there was a risk of being seen as not sufficiently like greened in Army culture, so that they would risk irrelevance. And it's especially important because when it comes to promotions, for instance, the Army has a centralized promotions process, and so people making decisions about career progression have to sort of understand how you fit into the broader culture. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's sort of two dimensions of this cultural dilemma. One is, what is the nature of how does cyberspace fit into modern warfare, specifically modern land warfare? And the second is, what makes for a cyber warrior, the personnel issue. So when it comes to the warfare issue, what I find really interesting is that there was a sort of deliberate attempt to make cyber things into Army things. So rather than trying to articulate new concepts and identities and roles, the individuals who worked on kind of helping to stand up the cyber branch and articulate a mission for it, an identity and so on, really sought to make cyber like the Army. And not just like any part of the Army, but like the apex in the hierarchy, right? To make cyber like maneuver, fire, and effects. I love this quote from Colonel Hall. He says, "My priority was to make a cavalryman in cyber, to make a commander, to make cyber more like the Army and less like military intelligence." No offense to anyone who may have a military intelligence background, but the fact that military intelligence is described as being opposed to the Army, right, shows subliminally how sort of the dominant paradigm is really focused on combat arms, right, and make it more like, by the Army he means make it more like infantry, artillery, and so on. My vision was to leverage the strength of the Army to make cyber things to be Army things. And so if you in conducting these interviews and reading all these early writings, the idea was that cyber should play an independent and supported, rather than supporting, role in modern land warfare. And some went as far as articulating a view of cyber warfare as sort of the true form of warfare in the modern era. One of the leaders I interviewed said that cyber warriors are engaging the enemy every day in cyberspace, right? Even more so than traditional combat arms. And so it's almost like a reimagining of what the apex of the hierarchy should be. But across sort of the language that's used in these writings, the analogies that are made, the symbols, the insignia, the heraldry, it's all explicitly drawing on sort of traditional Army warfighting culture and trying to fit cyber into it. So cyber is described in the language of maneuver, fires, and effects. People talked about how the Army needs to maneuver in cyberspace just as it maneuvers on land, right? Making very explicit analogies and being very deliberate about language to describe cyber operations. What I also found really interesting was that there was a deliberate effort to, going beyond signals and insignia, which I'll talk about in a moment, every branch in the Army has a numerical designation, and cyber is 17. Okay, why 17? The idea, and this is I'm quoting from one of the people I interviewed, was to, quote, have aviation to our left and special forces to our right, right? Even like the numerical designation of where the cyber branch is placed is meant to connote and reinforce the idea of cyber as this form of maneuver warfare, of it being like combat arms. This also bled into some aspects of the second question, which is what makes for a cyber warrior? Really in terms of the idea that cyber warriors should be operational commanders similar to combat arms. They should have mission command. They should have operational commanders who are empowered to make decisions, to operate, to exploit the initiative, and so on. we see this attempt to make cyber things into Army things bleeding over a bit into who is a cyber warrior. But as we'll see in a minute, most of those other aspects of that question are really drawn from cyber hacker culture, which becomes problematic. And as it turns out, when it came to questions of defining the role of cyberspace in warfare, cultural change happened, right? Like cyber was designated as officially as combat, at least on paper, right? We can talk about whether that's the case in practice, right? But like cyber is a combat arms branch, right? In theory, all of the language in Army doctrine about cyber operations mimics the language for maneuver fires and effects, particularly for fires for artillery, drawing on a lot of the doctrinal concepts from field artillery. So in theory, by drawing on existing cultural repertoires, these cultural entrepreneurs were able to help to create this blended culture within the Army that made cyber things into Army things. I really like comparing the branch insignia in particular because I think it illustrates this really nicely. You have infantry armor and field artillery on the left. You have signal corps and military intelligence on the right. And I spoke with the officers who were responsible, who made the insignia. And first of all, one of them told me that no one told them to do this. They just did it. Like they made an insignia. And then when the branch was created, they were like, oh, here, which is often how things happen in a bureaucracy, right? You take advantage of vacuums. But yeah, so when I spoke with these people, the idea was to deliberately draw on the symbols, the representations of combat arms. So it's, you have crossed rifles or crossed cannons, right? And so for cyber, you have the crossed lightning bolts. It's all gold. That was a deliberate choice, rather than having multiple colors. And what's really interesting is that the reality is that the personnel, most of the personnel who was seated into the cyber branch when it was first created came from either Signal Corps or from military intelligence. But there was a deliberate effort to make cyber something else, to define it as being separate and distinct from the branches where it actually grew out of, right? And the people who created the cyber branch insignia came from both Signal Corps and MI, right? But it was an attempt to define it as something new and different, but also as something that, was at sort of the top of the cultural hierarchy. And so that's how you get the branch insignia. And they actually printed these prototypes of it on 3D printers, right? Because obviously, it's cyber, so that's how you got to do it. And they wore them actually until like the branch officially made insignias. Anyway, so that's like, what is the role of cyber in modern warfare? Really framing cyber in terms of existing repertoires in Army culture. But when it came to who's the cyber warrior, the story is very different. All of these leaders and thinkers, these culture entrepreneurs, which we call them, they drew much more from cyber hacker culture in terms of how they attempted to represent what a cyber warrior should be. And they're explicit about how it's a different type of model than what would comport with traditional Army culture. Successfully leading cyber warriors takes a different type of leader, one who's comfortable in the inherently technical cyber domain, appreciates the technical expertise, and understands the personality types, creativity, culture, motivations, and intellectual capability of cyber warriors. So it's this different startup type of model. And there were all these ideas being floated about how to organize the branch and how to identify personnel. People were talking about kind of by name accessions, like literally looking around the Army for smart technical people who could be pulled into the branch. Oh yes, there's a quote. I love this quote from General Buckner. She led the first Army cyber school. She said to me, what are you going to do with a guy with a PhD in quantum from Stanford? Are you going to tell him to go lead a platoon? Right? Like this tension between looking for these exquisite technical people who may have attributes that are different from what the Army's dominant culture perceives as being important, right? I could have populated this whole slide with various quotes about not everyone needs to do push-ups. This isn't a biggest caveman in the tribe model. And these are all those quotes came from colonels and above. So, but they would self-style themselves as mavericks. But anyway, so the idea was we need to, while on the one hand articulating this view of warfare that is tries to fit cyber into a traditional model, populate it with these hackers, right? This innovative, experimental, individualistic, enterprising, risk-acceptant, anti-hierarchical individuals. And that created this real tension. It was a startup model. The idea was the cyber schoolhouse should look more like a startup than it should like a traditional schoolhouse, because the information that you learn in school is going to be nearly obsolete by the time you get out into the field, right? So how do we have this dynamic model? That ran up against trade-off culture and processes, which is, many would say, sort of the opposite of dynamic and flexible. And there was also this sentiment of needing to not invert, but sort of flatten the hierarchy, right, where you would have junior people, and in particular enlisted, who had greater technical skill and proficiency, and somehow you had to have a way for their voices to be heard. As you can imagine, the culture entrepreneurs were far less successful in getting these elements of a new cyber culture actually inculcated. In fact, in nearly all these dimensions, all these ideas that were thrown out, most of them met up with resistance, significant internal resistance, and ultimately failure. And so what you end up with is this sort of incomplete cultural change, which is the position that we're in, or I would argue that we're in right now, where on the one hand you have these, you have integration of cyber from a doctrinal perspective, from a formal perspective into, at the core of traditional Army culture. It's really seen as integral to modern warfare. But from a personnel perspective, the Army is met with a lot of challenges and issues with identifying, retaining, promoting the kinds of people who embody the original vision of the culture entrepreneurs of this hacker mindset. So I have some hypotheses on how this kind of split personality culture may affect outcomes we care about in strategy. And this is something that I'm kind of thinking through right now. One and obvious one is implications for the integration and disintegration of strategy. So much of doctrine and strategy for cyber and in other realms, of course, depends on the effective integration of kinetic and non-kinetic effects, right? And so there's a concern that a cyber culture that's kind of imperfectly or poorly incorporated into broader Army culture will lead to strategic ineffectiveness, right? Because you can't integrate cyber units into broader concepts for force employment. We see the importance of integration when you look at 2016 at Operation Glowing Symphony, which was where the United States, as part of Operation Inherent Resolve, tried to integrate cyber effects with kinetic effects on the battlefield in the counter-ISIS fight, and there are lots of debates about how effectively those were integrated. We see these ideas being reinforced in the 2023 DoD cyber strategy, which just came out last week, really making a call for the integration of cyber into broader campaigns. But how you're going to actually do that in practice if you have a cyber culture in military organizations that just doesn't quite fit, or you don't have the people to make it possible, I think is an open question. I think another implication is the implications for offense-defense, right? In general, there's this idea that military organizations have an inclination to offensive strategies and doctrines. If cyber cultures within various services or cyber organizations feel they have to fit cyber concepts into existing ones, that may kind of reinforce inclinations to the offense as they try to attempt to fit into the dominant kinetic warfighting culture, and we can talk about what the implications of that might be. And then finally, there's a real issue of recruitment and retention. This is not a new finding or insight when it comes to the military and cyber work roles, but I think that the cultural dimension of it is less explored. especially beyond the company grade level, there are real challenges with a perceived lack of credibility or competence of senior leaders who are brought in from other branches to fill roles because you have attrition past the company grade level. And so, I would argue that a cyber culture that lives in an inhospitable dominant culture may really exacerbate these challenges of retention and, create this negative feedback loop as the senior ranks are not populated by what are perceived as technically competent leaders. You've seen people call for the creation of a separate cyber service in part because of this. So I think there are lots of really interesting implications for how we think about culture, subcultures, and how they fit into broader cultures for strategy. But this is a part of the research that is sort of in an early phase, and would, of course, appreciate feedback and questions on that. That's kind of the project and where it's at. We're really interested in exploring, so again, this is a theory building endeavor. We're trying to generate some insights about how cyber cultures and military cultures interact to change or not change existing culture. So really interested in exploring how this may apply to other services. That's sort of a natural extension, but also, cross-nationally. I think there's some really interesting variation in terms of the relationship between civilian cyber cultures and military cultures in different countries, whether it's in Israel and the UK, other mature cyber powers. And so I'm just excited about this research agenda, and I really appreciate the chance to share it with you all today. And that's it. Looking forward to your questions. Thanks. Should I sit? Is that better?
You wanna sit? How about-
Sure.
Well, one cultural thing that military likes to go by numbers, and cyber is 17. At MIT, we also go by numbers, and I don't teach in political science. I teach in 17. Political science is 17 as well as the cyber. What I'd like to do before opening it up generally is, because we have active duty and many reserve officers here, I just want to get your first impressions and what would you like to challenge Eric on? What you find highly insightful? What might be left off? So, go ahead. And you might just stand up again, a second session, just say who you are a little bit. Stand up.
So I'm Victoria Henley. I'm a PhD student. I'm also an MI officer. I'm going to sit down because I need to read off my computer. So I really enjoyed your talk, but I'm a little bit curious about the variation you're trying to explain. So there was cultural change in this case, but are there some technologies where we didn't see cultural change? And as I think back to the radio or the motor or manned flight, all caused cultural change in the creation of units or branches that were specialized around those technologies. So is this change really surprising? And then sort of my second reaction to the story you told about this particular case is, I wonder to the extent to which, this was really a sudden reaction to asking to create a branch. Or was this really a really long contested process over time? As the signal branch and the MI branch tried to figure out how to respond to the development of computers and information technology. And I didn't really hear much about the functional areas that existed prior to the cyber branch that were trying to address this issue. And I'm really reminded of Susan Marquis's book on unconventional warfare and sort of the contested process of developing the Special Forces branch that to me follows a similar sort of path.
Thank you so much. Those are great questions. I was just trying to take notes while you were talking. So in terms of your first question, are there technologies that didn't see cultural? So yeah, there's no variation on the dependent variable. This is really meant to be more of a theory building exercise rather than a theory testing one. And so the next step, hopefully after this project, is to sort of test these ideas more systematically. So I think that's actually a really good idea to think about. Absence of change, although I would argue that at least from a strategic culture literature perspective, the default is the absence of change, right? Most of the arguments about strategic culture conceptualize it as something that doesn't change, that has long legs, right? That's enduring. And so I think it's the presence of change rather than the absence of change that's more surprising. And I also, I'm not actually sure that this is a case of complete change, right? It's more of a, and this is not a technical term of art at all, but more of like a Frankenstein's monster type of change where it's incomplete. And I think that's interesting too, because most of the literature on cultural change sees it as dichotomous, like change either happens or it doesn't happen. But to your point about this contested process, change can be messy and incomplete and imperfect. And I think there are implications for how that affects a number of outcomes that, I haven't had a chance to explore yet, but I think that's a really good point that you're making. In terms of a sudden reaction, I didn't mean to present it as that. This is sort of just a snapshot of the broader story. However, the decision to create a branch was something that was forced on the Army. Forced from within, right? Like forced from the top down, from General Odierno and others. Because there was a perception that Signal Corps and MI could not articulate, right, like models for what cyber was, and we're just mapping them to existing branch culture. And in fact, I would posture that those are examples of non-change, right? So maybe that's an interesting source of variation to explore, because within Signal Corps and MI, both of those branches were seeking a piece of the cyber mission. Ultimately, they had it taken away from them because they didn't change. So I don't know, so you give me some really interesting ideas. I really appreciate the questions, and hopefully I answered them sufficiently.
Yeah, Eric? I'm Eric Heckenbottom.
Hi.
I'm a principal research scientist here. I usually don't identify myself with my reservist career since it's very, very old. But as a reservist, I was fringed MI. I spent some time in the military police as well.
Yes.
I had a platoon there. Had a platoon in an infantry unit. As a platoon leader a lot of times, which for you military guys may suggest a promotion problem. But in any case, I was also a collection and jamming platoon leader. So, okay, all that aside, so as far as cultural change is concerned, I mean, it's a new branch, obviously, so I'm a little bit lost on where the change is, per se. Like, you're setting up a new branch, you're establishing sort of a new culture from raw materials you're receiving. So it's just a story of sort of Army cultural change and its ability to sort of adapt to new types of functions. And I apologize, Roger, I'm going to go on for just a little bit if I can make a couple of comments.
Don't apologize, go ahead.
So, I thought this was absolutely fascinating. You didn't really use the term sort of bureaucratic interests much, but I could see this particularly, when it came time to portraying the branch within the Army as basically, bureaucratic interests and fight over sort of resources and status, right? Identifying the branch with a dominant hierarchy. Then, with that affecting the culture or having an almost inevitable impact on how the culture is defined. And then, then subsequent impact on capabilities. So obviously, cyber could be defined in a variety of different ways. I don't think in principle it's any different from the collection and jamming platoon that I had. So it can be used to collect intelligence, right, and be a supporting arm that way. It can also be used to cause direct effects. So more of the combat support force. So it is a fascinating case because it can be defined in so many different, those two very, very different ways. And you can make an argument that its bigger role should be collection. I'll just give you one kind of interesting parallel maybe. That is, I studied China and the Space Force in China, the space assets. There was a fight over space assets, right? So the Air Force wanted them, and then a lot of folks within the space community wanted to become an independent service. The Air Force and these space folks wrote a series of books and articles in which they established entirely, literally different language, different lexicon for all functions, and a different set of sort of military functions which they could execute. So the independent guys wanted a much more sort of warfighting approach. The Air Force wanted to hold space in as really overwhelmingly support force. So, you know, you can imagine there's a very obvious set of implications with regard to what kind of capabilities are going to be produced, you know, depending on how you define force and starting with how the force was organized and who owned it. So I'll kind of shut up there, but it's fascinating work. I apologize if I didn't really have a question there. Other than what the, you know, kind of state of what the definition here of cultural change might be. And also, I would like to get your reaction to sort of this idea of, I think it was in there, you just didn't use the word sort of bureaucratic inference.
Yeah, so, no, I think that's great, and comments are useful too, not just questions. But yeah, the bureaucratic politics piece, I agree. I think, and in the paper that we have, we talk about bureaucratic politics, but I see it as being part of the story, but not sufficient, right? Certainly there is a bureaucratic politics element, not only within the Army in terms of trying to secure greater resources by defining something that aligns with the apex of the hierarchy, but also is an inter-service piece to it too, right? Because you had all of the services trying to figure out how they would organize themselves for cyber, and the Army actually thought at the time that it was behind, especially behind the Air Force, and so there was this internal bureaucratic politics dimension, but also an inter-service rivalry one. I think it's part of the story, right? But I think that we can't understand the full story without looking at the cultural dimension. So I wouldn't write off bureaucratic politics as an explanation. In fact, I asked a lot of the people I interviewed, I asked, like, well, was this a deliberate, like, did you, like you clearly were deliberate in your language, right? In talking about this in terms of fires, right? Like, and yeah, they acknowledged that this was a deliberate choice, right? That, you didn't want, you had to make it fit into the existing framework, but there was also an element of true belief in there too that I think is more of a cultural and identity one than a purely bureaucratic maneuvering story. It's hard to parse with interviews and things like that, but and again, this is meant to be more insight generating that I'm hoping to use to test in a variety of ways. But I do acknowledge, I don't think we can write off bureaucratic politics as being part of it.
We have a second Eric, who is also in technology and is in the reserves, just younger than this Eric.
And I wasn't a jamming and collection platoon leader. Erica Greenberg, I'm a faculty member in the department. Thanks so much for the talk, Erica. I think you tell this pretty compelling story that Army cyber culture is this kind of blend of the Army's internal culture with this external hacker culture. I'm wondering if there's multiple ways to view this external culture or external cultures that are having an effect on the Army cyber culture. And you kind of alluded to this in your response to Eric, but it seems like there's different levels of kind of outside groupness, right? You've got your hackers that are totally outside, but then you also, as you mentioned earlier, have the other services which in mid to late 2010 are also trying to figure out what the heck to do, right? So how much cultural learning or just cultural transmission is happening from those other services, right? Like Air Force cyber is also, their officer career field is also 17, right? So
yeah.
If you can talk a little bit about that, that'd be awesome.
I think that's a great point. We do, I don't mean to keep referring to a paper that you haven't read, I apologize, but in this paper that we're working on, we do refer to other cultural influences, and I would say it extends beyond the other services, also to the signals intelligence community, right, and NSA in particular, in the case of the United States, where when you think about how culture gets institutionalized, the NSA owns the courses that all of these personnel were, until the services could stand up their own own courses, that the NSA by and large owned them, and therefore played a role in shaping how people thought about cyberspace. So I agree that there are a variety of external cultural influences. I focus more on the cyber hacker culture because it provides this really salient distinction, but I think that's a great point to, and we do talk about it, but to bring up a little bit more about cultural learning and cross-pollination, especially with the Air Force, because I'm doing the comment, not question thing too, I guess, which is kind of ruminating. But anyway, the influence of the Air Force, I think, was paramount, not only because the Air Force was a first mover in cyber, but also because Strategic Command, the Air Force was the executive agent of Strategic Command, where Cyber Command lived until it became a unified combatant command. So I do think you see, for the Air Force especially, this sort of potentially cross-cultural comparison. The concept of fires also, and integrated fires. So it is a really good point, and I do think it's one of those areas where extending beyond this initial project, looking at the other services and integration is really, really fascinating. Yeah.
Designed to be large and look like wings from a distance, right? So.
Yeah. I didn't see the wings, but now that you say it, I like that a lot. Yeah.
Shep, do you have a two-finger on?
It's a one thing.
All right, Nate.
Thanks. Nate Padgett, I'm a pilot in the Air Force. So if we accept, and I do, that the experience is at the junior level and we've got this kind of hacker mindset,
Yeah.
how or should the culture kind of grapple with the inherent strategic nature of the medium? And so effectively, my concern would be that you have this kind of potential lone actor who thinks that he's better or smarter than the bureaucracy, who now has the possibility to create these kind of, on behalf of America, I have accomplished X, and you have these kind of broader events, and the individual may not understand kind of the broader strategy or how their operation fits.
I think that's a great question. Although I think it's true not just in cyber, right? I think it's true across various specialties, but perhaps it's uniquely salient in cyberspace. I actually talked about this with one of the with a captain who a cyber branch captain in the Army who I interviewed, and his take. I mean, he made this exact point, but almost in an inverted way in terms of the implications, which was that it is only someone who is who really understands the operational environment and has a technical expertise that can assess the implications of operating in cyberspace. And that if you take people who don't understand the technical environment, they may, underestimate, misestimate, overestimate what cyber as a tool can do. And therefore, perhaps counterintuitively, more junior people who are, have fresher and more current technical expertise may actually better understand what that tool is useful for. But I could see the alternative argument too. I think that's a policy. I think that gets at some of the policy implications of this. I think it also relates to ideas kind of floating around in the space about the creation of a separate service that can inculcate a service culture that is unique to the cyber domain. We could debate about whether that's the right way to go or whether that will just, replicate existing dysfunctions in a new organization. But I think that's a really great question.
All right, okay, yes.
Alan Janigian, a naval officer. So we're trying to build internal cyber culture, but it's also going to be a component of a much larger service culture. So as we're building that, in my own experience, that service culture, that joint culture is based on a appreciation, respect for capabilities and limitations. So if I look at a big problem, I understand, okay, the Army can handle this element, the Air Force can handle this element. I know what they can do and what they can't do. But capabilities and limitations in the cyber realm is such a close hold, it's so closely guarded that I don't think the other elements or the other services, without a need to know, don't really understand cyber capabilities, and as a result aren't able to appreciate them and incorporate them in larger elements. So do you view that sort of classification barrier as a hindrance to building that culture, and if so, how can it be overcome?
I think there's some element to that that's certainly a hindrance, although I would argue that a lot of the things that an operational commander needs to know are not particularly exquisite or classified, right? I think the solution to that is improving joint PME, is having meaningful cyber curricula that are part of PME requirements at the service level and and in joint PME institutions. I think the quality right now is, like, I guess I can say this, is pretty lousy, pretty abysmal. Really outdated, like just some of the modules are so outdated, and so I think that some of that can be addressed through education, and I think you have to start maybe counterintuitively at the more senior levels and work your way down, because I think that's where some of the greatest gaps maybe exist. But I think education can address a lot of that. You don't need really sensitive technical intelligence to be able to kind of appreciate, what the cyber domain is and what cyber is good for, what it's not good for, what are its limitations, all those points that you were making. But I think to me the solution is education.
Carl.
Lonergan, 20-year Army officer, active, similar to Alan's comment. 20 years of service. Of course, I've heard about the creation of cyber.
Yes.
Never have seen a cyber warrior.
You've never seen a cyber warrior?
Never seen a cyber warrior. In the past 10 years, I've been at the theater level, joint organizations. I'm a logistics officer, so of course I'm not MI or others, but that's the problem right now in the Army, is how specialized they are, how compartmentalized they are, and the challenges that we have. Similar to Eric, I've had a lot of experience jumping different branches. Started off in combat arms and then moved to quartermaster and then to logistics. And that kind of gets at one of my questions here is just, as you examine the incomplete cyber branch culture change, just interested as you look at other possible case studies of other recent branch or functional area creations that have come out over the past really 20 years that the Army created, when there really wasn't that shock or catalyst moment to create that large push to create that branch, and just how successful those functional areas or new branches were with sponsorship or being owned by one of the other branches, compared to cyber, which has really been kind of off by itself, trying to form this culture itself, is kind of an interesting look that I would recommend. And I'm not sure if you've looked at some of the other changes that the Army's gone through recently.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and something that I've in a cursory way looked at, but not deeply. So I think along with one of the first questions about variation on the dependent variable, things that didn't change, I think there's some really interesting ideas about that. In terms of the compartmentalization of cyber, I think some of that gets at the retention challenges at like field grade and above, right, where you don't have you have real challenges with attrition, and so, I guess if you may not have encountered anyone, any like field grade and above, in the cyber branch, but even if you had, chances are that they may not be as steeped in cyber as some of the, company grade and below are, and I think that's sort of the self-reinforcing negative feedback loop of having this incomplete or incoherent culture where, where on the one hand you have, elements of doctrine organization that, conceptualize cyber as this is like the forefront of war fighting, but on the personnel side, you just don't have the right people or can't retain the type of technical people that you would need. I also think that again, like this is presenting or presenting how the people who are involved in this are projecting images of like their ideal and what they want. I think it's a separate question to examine like whether that is how it should be, right? Because there were a lot of debates when the branch was created about how technical personnel who accede into the branch need to be, right? And whether everyone has to be super technical or whether you need people who can translate the technical aspects of cyberspace to the broader, at the broader operational and strategic level. So like, this is their representation. I don't necessarily know it's perhaps the best way to go about things.
warrant officer accessions
The warrant-
more for
yeah.
this branch?
Yeah.
As a technical
Yes.
way of retaining
Yes.
and keeping that progression moving forward?
Yes.
I think that's similar to logistics, aviation.
Yeah.
Those are some of the similar retention problems we face
Yeah.
with retaining our best and brightest.
Yeah.
I'm going to open it up, but I want to make one comment first, and it has to do, I think I was going to maybe put a Marine fellow on the spot. But you put physical prowess as a military value, which really isn't, part of the cyber game. And it seemed, when I was in high school, I mean, the wrestlers who were going to become Marines, I was on the basketball team, we're going to become Air Force guys. But they had, their sign that in the room that they turned up to 120 degrees, that which fails to kill you only makes you stronger. These are the guys who are in the Marines. So some of these are like self-selected, and some of these services have like a physical prowess kind of idea that drew them. And so I gotta believe it's hard for like Marines who are so much on some of the, small unit physical prowess, taking orders from some geek who can't do 10 push-ups. Is this a problem? I'll just throw that out. But it seems that to me that, yeah.
Sorry, you want to take a step first like this?
So, it's funny you bring that up because when I saw that, I started defending it in my mind, which means you're right. It's culturally imbued. So the Marine Corps is a very physical culture. That's the credibility comes with that, and I would say all the services have that to some degree.
Except the Air Force.
Oh, shots fired.
Hey, shots fired.
But I think that is a problem. Is somebody with red hair or pink hair, we're going to look differently at them. Somebody that is not able to do push-ups, we're going to look differently at them. But you can have subcultures within an organization, but it's very difficult to do. Especially as you get with the hierarchical structure or pyramid associated with it, what's important to the institution, who do you keep, how do you keep them, and all that stuff. So I appreciated your talk because it's really hard to develop a consistent established subculture within the larger organization that's different.
Especially with centralized promotion, right? Because the promotion boards are not like, it's not that your branch, it's not that promotion decisions are made at the branch level, right? I would add, in addition to the different color hair, right? You could talk about neurodiverse people. You could talk about people with physical disabilities, like all. And if you look at, and this is beyond the scope of this research, but if you look at other models, right, in other countries and how they treat cyber, that's not, there are more flexible ways of thinking about what a military organization in cyber looks like. I think the response to that is that, well, then it can't live in the services. It has to be its own service. Whether that's politically feasible, I don't know. We just got a Space Force, so cyber may have to take a knee for a little bit. That's a separate question. But I think you're totally right, and I think that, to get back to your point about, would someone who does lots of push-ups want to take orders from some geek, who can't.
They're actually highly respected.
No, I can't do a lot of push-ups, so I get it. But I would say that like you're not going the challenge is that you're just not going to find those people in the Army or in the like those that person will not inherently select in or will be selected out pretty rapidly. And so the people trying to build the branch would say that that's the problem. And one of the quotes that really stood out in my mind of when the people I interviewed said that what they were looking to recruit was Uncle Ned's nephew in his basement who's coding, right? Like, but that's not actually someone who the Army is going to recruit for any work role.
But I think it is something that I think is starting to change. Like, the former commandant of the Marine Corps, 65 years old, and he's doing a fitness test that I'm doing.
Right.
And it's painful to watch. That individual is getting paid for their brain, not for their muscles at that point. And I think that is starting to shift, but it's very difficult to do.
Kristen, you want to come in on?
So, yeah, so Kristen Wild, I'm a flight surgeon, Air Force, but I can do push-ups. So, at a few at a time. So I think some of it is a couple of points. So I just came from Lackland Air Force Base, where we are the sole sessions for all of the Air Force. And particularly medical standards was what I owned there. And so you're absolutely right. We select out. We don't even bring these kids in, because the DODI is written in such a way that a neurodivergent kid is weeded out nearly immediately. Or we put them through our behavioral analysis section, and they have good data to say, hey, if you don't do well on this screening exam, and then we bring you in and we talk to you, and you still don't do well, the likelihood of you making it through your first enlistment is abysmally low, right? How do we change, how do we get at letting some of those one-off weirdos in, right, is what we could end up labeling them as, but how do we bring some of that in a controlled way, which then doesn't lead to, we have now bought their medical problems for the rest of eternity, which is where we're at. The other part of that is the retention, right? And so when, I don't know who's at the policy decision-making part, when we went away from high 3 and went to blended retirement system, quite frankly, I think the DoD is going to become a puppy mill of training for technical skills. You're not going to see a cyber warrior who can make 6 figures, but as a staff sergeant with a family, they're going to make food stamps, right? They qualify for food stamps. So like, how do you approach that and understand that those are the types of skills that you're needing to bring in, and you have to compensate them because they can go make 6 figures on the outside and not live at the poverty line?
I mean, I'm in violent agreement with everything he said. I don't know that I have an answer, although what's interesting is I've spoken with a colleague who does a lot of the sort of manpower analysis for the Army, and they do surveys all the time. And when it comes to cyber, certainly particularly on the enlisted side, yes, like the financial opportunity cost is tremendous, but on the officer side, a lot of it is more about culture and mission and morale than it is about the financial opportunity costs, which I think tells you a story about all this. But no, I agree with everything you said. I don't have a solution, but yeah, it's a challenge.
Ken Loy, who leads our program on emerging technologies. Ken?
Sure. Thank you for a very rich talk. The fact that we could be going at several levels in this conversation is testimony to what you've done. I want to pose a question at a more abstract level. As tempted as I am to talk about wrestlers. At the beginning of your talk, you set up by noting that this was an unusual area, that all the cultural comments you were making were premised on the observation that we had not had a cyber Armageddon, a cyber Pearl Harbor. So 2 questions that follow kind of directly from that. If you look to aircraft-launched attacks, aircraft carriers, and Pearl Harbor, or you look to Hiroshima and nuclear weapons, or you look to 9/11 and terrorism, in each instance, what we have are catalytic events. And they're catalytic in the sense that the organizational changes that followed were really only possible by virtue of the clear demonstrations that had taken place. By contrast, cyber doesn't look that way. So the counterfactuals are, imagine nuclear weapons without Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or terrorism without 9/11, and these are not absurd possibilities, or for that matter, aircraft carriers and naval attacks without Pearl Harbor. And in what sense were the changes that followed in those areas, in fact, very much dependent on the specifics of the catalytic events? And conversely, we can imagine cyber Pearl Harbors and attacks. There are all kinds of possibilities that many in this room have worked on. Redo, in a sense, your analysis of implications for strategy, organization, and personnel, but with, I'm going to use the technical language here from MIT, bad shit happening that, in fact, gets people's attention, resolves all the debates over significance and the like. We can talk wrestling and personnel decisions later.
Yeah, Joel and then Daniel and George, and then I'll go this side. We'll try to go a little past 1:30 because we got a lot of conversations, so if you have to leave, we won't hold it against you if you have to leave at 1:30, but let's start with you.
I'm Joel Renner. I'm a research fellow here. I'm the former Inspector General of NSA and counterintelligence unit. Yeah. One question and then a couple of observations. I'm struck by, first place, I really liked your report. That was good. I'm struck by, in many of the comments, how, from military people, how isolated this problem is from what they were doing, including, as Carl said, in logistics, which is a little curious given the penetrations of Transcom, for example, right? I mean, it's bizarre that that should be regarded as isolated. But the question is, what lessons do you think could be drawn from the conflict in Ukraine right now? If I'm sitting here listening to you as a flag officer in Ukrainian armed forces, thinking about the, I'm probably inclined to think that cyber is an aspect of everything we're doing on the battlefield. Kinetic stuff as well as just the geeks in the closet. That's the question. A couple of comments, miscellaneous comments. I don't agree that there hasn't been a major body blow, you call an exogenous event. Not indeed a Pearl Harbor, and I've previously posited in some ways in which that might take place, but I think the Snowden event was, in fact, I would call it exogenous because I think he's a penetration agent. And I think the penetration of OPM and the theft by the Chinese of 20-some million personnel files and people with clearances, these were astounding events with consequences, serious consequences, not to the nation as a whole perhaps, but to the military and to the intelligence community. So I think you should, I recommend taking that into account. The last comment I have has to do with a couple of things I think you've left out of your list of characteristics of cyber attacks. And one is the ability and willingness to follow orders and keep secrets. And this, and of course, as having spent time in counterintelligence, has been a big issue for me. I've been thinking about these things for a long time. And I think the problems, as you finish up your work in this, can I say, constricted area of this particular branch, I would say that the problems you're presenting are much wider than just the creation of the branch. The military as a whole is having trouble, and the intelligence community as a whole, are having trouble assimilating people who can't keep their mouth shut and who are indiscreet across the board in their personal lives as well as their professional lives. And people don't behave radically differently in their professional lives than they do in their personal lives. These are problems that in both recruitment and retention and operations from the military across the board.
Daniel?
Yeah, hi, I'm Daniel Siebel. I'm a second-year PhD student here in the department. I have lots of questions. I'll try to keep just like one or two. I also sort of just agree with the comment that there hasn't been exogenous shocks, right? There might not have been like an exogenous shock in the U.S. where we've been the victim of an attack, but I think of examples like Stuxnet just over the past decade and a bit. Like we've seen that a lot of what cyber can do, what it can't do, and so I think there has been like a shift change. I think it's even like reflected in your paper with Jackie Snyder on like changes in DoD cyber strategy, right? And like the language that's used, whether it's deterrence or norms. So I think like drawing from that might be interesting and thinking about culture. And then I also have a question. You're talking about like eventually extending this to think about like other states and other sort of cultures. What's something I've always been curious about is why other states allow sort of like moonlighting for their like cyber warriors, whatever you want to call them, right? So because it seems odd, right? You think of like Russia and China, you think of very sort of like top-down hierarchical states and structure, but yet we know that they allow their cyber operators to go and commit crimes on their own time, sometimes using the same sort of TTPs. So, but we don't see that in the US or in other sort of countries. And so something that might be interesting to think about or thinking about like looking for variation in culture is this like idea of moonlighting. And that's something like maybe you can talk about more later at the lunch. But those are, if that's interested in hearing about, if you have any thoughts.
Response to
Yeah, you
some of
can
these,
find
or-
out.
Oh, okay. Just that one? Okay. Yeah.
Joel had like big
Yes.
comments, which.
Okay, so yeah, so the moonlighting thing, I think that is a really that's a really interesting question. It actually intersects with like work I did before cyber on proxy war, so I just find it inherently fascinating. I think that, you know, I think like closed regimes are like bureaucratic and hierarchical and maybe less flexible in some ways, but there's this whole idea of like, you know, pressure release valves and autocratic regimes, whether it's a function of like allowing nationalist protests under certain conditions. And I think that in the virtual space too, there is some element of keeping people busy who might otherwise, so because these regimes are, they care as much, if not more, about threats to their own rule than they do about external threat. And I think that is especially salient when it comes to digital technologies, right? Because those are a means of for human rights activists and protesters to coordinate and share information and breach great firewalls and so on. So I think that in terms of the moonlighting issue, I think in some ways that can be a strategy for co-opting potential threats to the regime and keeping skilled technical people busy fighting wars abroad, so digital wars abroad, so they don't come home to roost. But I could also see that backfiring in some interesting ways, and so I think that's a really great question.
Okay, George, you'll have the last, and then we'll
Collect questions here at the end. Hey, thanks, Roger. Appreciate it. Erica, incredible presentation. I find this extremely fascinating work that you're getting into. So I'm Colonel George Kloppenberg, originally commissioned an armor officer and then assessed into acquisition corps, right? So we live this world in a culture of where we draw from our previous culture and we try to bring it into our current one. So I got one question, and I'm going to provide a little bit of context to the room, so it'll be an easy question, but it'll give you time to think of an answer. How do you handle the challenge that you may not yet be studying a steady state culture, right? If the branch started in 2014 for the room, that means you started with some privates and lieutenants in 2014. They've been in 9 years, so they're probably, they're a major, right? So they're just starting to see strategic operations within cyber branch, but they may not yet be really making those decisions, nor are they making the decisions about the culture of their branch. The majority of the folks that you cite in there are retired, right? They all came from where, a previous branch, and then they assessed into cyber, so they wanted to pull that culture in. But what are the lieutenants and privates of 9 years ago? What culture are they going to ultimately reside on for this cyber branch? So I'm just curious how you might handle that challenge.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we are in unsettled times because the branch is relatively new, but the Army has been doing cyber since before 2014, right? And this gets back to some of the other questions about the contestation that happened beforehand and what resulted in the decision to create a branch in the first place. And so, in particular, I think that there's a really interesting story to be examined by someone, maybe me, maybe not, about how experiences of like pre-cyber on the battlefield in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly when it came to targeting and other things, shaped how some of the more junior personnel who would eventually, accede into cyber, thought about cyber, right? I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. I agree that it's unsettled. We may see it reifying over time, but I could also see a case where it persists in this kind of incoherent, incomplete, constitution of culture that results in kind of a number of dysfunctions and problems. But I guess I would just push back a little bit on the idea that that cyber began in 2014, right? The branch began in 2014, but there were a lot of people thinking about it and operating in what we would now call cyber work roles before 2014. And in fact, when the branch was created, the people who created the branch, they literally had to go through all the various work roles and say, okay, is this person who is doing this thing, are they cyber? Are they still signal corps? What are they? What are they doing? And so those legacies, I think, do shape where the current culture is
I
now.
don't disagree. I think you're spot on. That it started a lot before, but it didn't start for those lieutenants and privates that are now
Right.
only just majors, right? And so will they continue that same culture, or will the culture shift again because they have no context of being armor, infantry,
Or will
medical,
they leave?
right? They have no context at all. They've just been cybers.
Yeah.
What's it going to morph to? What's it going to look like? Because that underpins a lot of your studies and inferences that you're making. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, we got to collect questions on this side. I'll stand up. Charlie and Chicago, and Suzanne, and you'll finish up.
Hi, I'm Charlie Glazer.
Hi.
I have a question. I think it's a theory question, which I don't think you've dealt with much, which is a distinction between function and culture. So, I mean, a lot of what you described to me just sounds like what you would do to build capability and meet the functions of an institution, not culture. So, like when you say, well, you would hire guys who were like, or people who had like these cyber skills and did physics, but that's not a cultural issue. Those are the people that have the technical skills to be effective in cyber. So how do you separate out function from culture, which, and I think that's an ongoing theme in much of the literature, is basically that culture you sort of see as some deviation from the proper functional role that somehow either like resolves indeterminacy or leads an institution astray. I didn't see much of that in your presentation. I saw a lot of talking about the functional requirement for cyber. So that's one dimension. I think it would be good to sort of like, you need to draw a little bit of like a baseline which is separate from the culture. And then I would also maybe encourage you to distinguish between sort of just like organizational integration across branches. So like, it's hard to be joint. That's been a huge, so like if you create a separate branch, it's not something, is it a difficulty of integrating function across different functional specializations? Or is it culture that's blocking that? And I think that the fault should be that it's organizational structure and specialization, and then culture becomes the explanation for what doesn't get explained. Now, somebody else could say, why give priority to the function over culture? That's just how I would set it up. But either way, I think you need to do some of that, and I think that's sort of missing. So I would just encourage you to sort of build those in. I'm not saying it does damage to what you have, but I think it provides sort of a kind of critique that against which you have to sort of compare your observations.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Suzanne. I'm a third-year PhD student. My question is sort of post-theory, which is how are you sort of measuring organizational culture in all of your interviews, especially, right? Because culture, it can be such an ideational, transient thing. And if you want to use it as sort of a discrete thing, then you have to know what it was before it changed. And so what are your measurement criteria?
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm a Chicago Wiki. I'm a visiting scholar here. In other times, I'm a professor at a Japanese university. I have a few questions. One is about the importance of cyber in basically fighting a war and winning and prevailing. How much is this importance understood and shared, or within the U.S. military as a whole? And do you see a correlation between the sort of the awareness of the importance or sort of understanding of the importance of cyber in winning a war correlate with sort of a change in their culture? That's one question, because I think the catalytic event is a clear case of showing the importance, and I was wondering whether people who think it's important to prevail in the future or winning a war. One other thing is trying to understand this phenomena. Is this more to do with the changing of the culture of those who are closely associated with the cyber command, or are you more interested in sort of the whole of the U.S. military as a whole? So, and related to that, what do you think is necessary in terms of culture if U.S. military and its allies were to fully take control of the cyber technology and sort of command, so that the U.S. and the allies could actually use this to prevail. So is the culture necessary to do that? One other thought. Space Command is new too, right? And I don't hear too much about space. You didn't mention space, and I'm wondering whether, there's no cultural clash, as it were, as opposed to a cyber, because you have sort of a physical stereotype of who a cyber warrior might be different from space, although there are a lot of very new things that are very foreign to the traditional way of thinking. It's just whether any comparison like that culture clash doesn't seem to be.
Thank you. I'm Ron Siegel, an alum of the program. And I was wondering, are you adopting a narrow or a broad definition of cyber? Narrow would be disrupting the other side's computer systems and defending your own. And their hacker culture might predominate. And broad would be the whole computer infrastructure by which the output of drones with sensors targets smart munitions on the enemy. And there you would have more of an IBM computer programming type thing, which is maybe not that different from the military. And just an aside, you're probably never going to see a cyber Pearl Harbor in peacetime, because some of the nastier stuff can only be done once.
All right, so pick and choose among us, quite a broad list, but you get the idea of all what's on people's minds here. So.
Lots of great questions. I won't be able to get to all of them. Charlie, to your question about culture and function, I'm a bit more deliberate about it in this draft paper, but I'll definitely clarify. That's a really important point that I need to clarify, so I really appreciate that. In terms of the cyber Pearl Harbor debate, a number of people have raised that question. I think that, I'm on the side of there has been no cyber Pearl Harbor. I'm also on the side of I don't think there ever will be, but that's a separate thing. In terms of whether Snowden and other types of breaches have been an exogenous shock, they have, but what's interesting is they haven't been, those are to me intelligence cyber Pearl Harbors, right? They're not, if anything, we might have expected that might lead the U.S. to think about cyber as really reinforce the idea of cyber as an counterintelligence problem. Whereas what you're seeing is cyber as a warfighting issue, not problem, but as a warfighting function. And I think maybe that's unexpected, given that the exogenous shocks that have happened have all been intelligent, SolarWinds, Snowden, and so on have been intelligence shocks rather than military ones, right?
They've affected operations.
Right. No, they have, but not in cyber. Well, yeah. What else? A narrow or broad definition. This is a narrower definition of cyberspace and cyber operations, but I take your point. It could be broadened. I think it could be further broadened to think about the information environment too, and it's really just a matter of scoping to enable the research. I don't even remember where I wrote down all these questions on my paper, but what else?
Why don't you just take one more?
One more. Is there one more question?
No, it's not more. One.
Oh, one more of things I can hardly read my handwriting, but how much is the importance of cyber understood within the broader military? That was your question. Not very well. I just don't think it is. I'm not sure that. I guess I'm not making a proposition that that cyber is decisive in modern warfare. This was an attempt to examine different beliefs and ideas about its role, but I don't think that that cyber is understood well at all. I think there's still this very antiquated idea at the most senior levels that cyber is a magic button that you sprinkle cyber dust on things and centrifuges spin too fast, right? And that is just does not reflect reality. And I would argue that part of that could be attributed to this incoherence of culture, or this fear, to your point earlier, that you end up with cyber cultures that are, so siloed and in their own little myopic realm that they become disintegrated with broader military strategy and campaign plans and so on, and that's problematic too. So that was a very long-winded way of saying it's a problem.
We're well past time, which
Yeah,
shows
sorry.
It's an indication of
How interested we are in your work and how much you enjoyed your talk, so let's thank you.